So we started a series last weekend that we are just calling The Arrival, and I have a picture I want to show you as we get kicked off this morning. A picture that maybe this will seem familiar to you in some ways. If you're anything like me, you have probably become a little bit dependent on this little device that we have called our phone that will take us places. If we put in an address, it will tell us where to go and how to get there, right? We've gotten dependent enough on those that, the printed maps are pretty much extinct at this point. You have to want to find one of those to find it. But if you're anything like me, you've had good experiences with your GPS on your phone, and then you've probably also had not so good experiences. You've had times where you ask it to take you somewhere, and you would never find this place on your own, and it takes you right there, But then there are also these moments where you are supposed to meet someone at a restaurant, and your GPS takes you into a neighborhood, and you hear this pronouncement, "You have arrived," and you're kind of like, "No, I don't think I have. This is not where I'm supposed to be," right? Or you go to a wedding, and you're invited to a wedding in downtown Denver, and you go down there, and your phone, in whatever accent, British or otherwise, that you have it programmed to talk to you, says, "You've arrived," and you look around, and there's no wedding venue anywhere around that you can tell, and it's kind of like, I'm not so sure that I got the brightest GPS in my system here. I think I might need a new lady because she keeps taking me the wrong places, right? That's kind of what happens at times. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And as we jump in this morning to our series, like I mentioned, what we're calling the series is The Arrival. What we're doing is we're kind of walking toward Christmas, talking about the arrival of Jesus at Bethlehem. And can you believe, like a month from tomorrow is Christmas. That just hit me this weekend, and it's like, there's a lot to be done next month. There is a lot that we have to do. I can't believe it's already time for this, but we're walking toward the arrival of Jesus, and really what we're doing, not just talking about the arrival of Jesus at Bethlehem, but we're also asking, how can we recognize when God arrives in our world today? How do we recognize His voice? How do we recognize His leadership? How do we know that it's really Him? I think if we're honest, kind of like the GPS thing, I think a lot of times we look up at Christmas and we realize, you know what? I see that all of the LED lights have arrived. I see that the trees have arrived. I see that the presents have arrived. The Christmas songs are playing on the radio. But I don't know if God has really arrived in my world. I don't know that I really sense His presence and feel Him leading me, guiding me. Maybe one of those things where you look up and say, okay, I hear people talk about this God that He's not seen and typically He's not heard. And so how do I know? If I'm praying, how do I know He's hearing me? How do I know that He's speaking back to me? How do I know that He's leading me? How can I know if this is God or if this is just a good idea? And so really that's what we're trying to explore as we walk toward Christmas. We're asking the question, how do we recognize the arrival of God in our world? Christmas is a unique time of year because for some people this is that time of year where you would say this is the most wonderful time of year, right? And I think all of us as kids start off with that mindset. This is the best time of year. If we were to take a poll here this morning, I guarantee you some people would say, yes, I love Christmas. This is the most wonderful time of year. But I would also guess that there would be a number of people here that would say, yeah, I like Christmas, but it's hard. Because Christmas is the time where family is connecting, where people are coming together. And maybe there are relationships in your families that are broken. And you look at that and you think, I like Christmas as long as I don't have to deal with that relationship. Or it maybe this time of year just reminds you of the losses that you've experienced. The people that you love, the people that you were close to, the people that are not going to be celebrating Christmas with you this year. It could be that this is a time of year that just reminds you of kind of the accumulation of failures that happen in life. When you're with people that know you most and know you most intimately, it's really easy to start looking at life and thinking, things things haven't always gone so well, right? And so this is a time of year that's hard for a lot of people. In fact, statistics show us that there are more suicides that happen during this holiday season in our country than any other time of year, because it's a hard time for some people. So if you are there, if you're at that place where you say, yeah, I appreciate Christmas, I like the holidays, but I am not so sure that this is my favorite time of year, I think you'll appreciate what we're going to look at today. Because we're going to look at a passage that deals with exactly that. How do we recognize the presence of God, the arrival of God, in the midst of hardship and difficulty and struggle? And to do that, we're going to look at a little book in the Old Testament called Micah. I'm sure you guys have been reading Micah this week, right? And just we're waiting to hear from the book of Micah. Now, this is a book we don't look at just a whole lot, but it's a book that, if you were with us recently, we read through the book of Jonah. If you remember that, if you actually read through the book of Jonah with us, Micah is the very next book. So if you read Jonah and remember where that is, you can find Micah. Otherwise, if you just say, forget it, it's going to be on the screen. You don't have to worry about it, right? So Micah, just to give you a little context, Micah is a guy, he was a prophet who lived about 700 years before Jesus was born. And he lived in a time that wasn't a great time in the history of Israel. For those of you who are Old Testament scholars, you may know that time period, 700 years before Jesus comes, is a time where the nation of Israel was actually being invaded by the empire of Assyria. And the much bigger empire of Assyria is coming down. They're invading Israel, and they're actually taking people from Israel out, deporting them to work as basically slave labor in other areas. And so, as you can imagine, this is a time in their history where they're looking up and they're kind of saying, where's God? You know, we thought we were the Jews, we thought we were God's chosen people, and now we're being attacked, and where's God? We're not seeing him, we're not recognizing him in the midst of all of the struggle, of the heartache that we're going through right now. So that's the context that we're going to be looking at. Micah comes along and he has some words for those people in that context that I think really apply to us as well and help us see how to recognize God in our world today. So Micah chapter 5, we're going to start with verse 1. And it says this. It says, marshal your troops, O city of troops, for a siege is laid against us. So this is, again, one of those points, if you don't know the context, this verse just over your head doesn't mean anything, right? But a siege is laid against us. That's the Assyrians coming against the people of Israel. And it says, they will strike Israel's ruler on the cheek with a rod. So what he's saying here is he's saying that we have a king in Israel, but the king is basically impotent. The king can't do anything. He's powerless to defend us against this empire of Assyria that's coming in. So much so that they strike him on the face with a rod. I mean, he is the high leader, and they're just insulting him, right? And there's nothing that he can do about it. Just to imagine what this would feel like, just to kind of put ourselves in their shoes. Think about it in a little bit different context. You're going to have to imagine with me for a minute, okay? But put on your imagination cap here. And imagine that China attacks the United States. And for whatever, I know some of you guys are military guys, and so I know it would be hard to imagine this. But imagine, for some reason, our military has been disabled. It has been hamstrung. And the military can't do anything. And so our president, our commander-in-chief, is at a place where he has no ability to help us as a nation. And you see the Chinese coming in after they've attacked our nation and literally coming into your neighborhood and taking your neighbors and taking some of your family members and deporting them back overseas so that they can go into forced labor. That's not a very good feeling, right? I mean, it's not a good place to be in. And that's exactly what the people of Israel are dealing with. They're watching their family members be deported so that they can serve as slaves in this foreign empire that these people have never seen with their own eyes. It's a really hard time for them. Maybe you've never been there, But you know what hardship is, right? You know the feeling of loss. You know the feeling of how are we going to make it financially. You know the feeling of broken relationships. And so it's in that kind of context that Micah is speaking to these people and saying, you need to pay attention to these things because this is how you're going to recognize God in that hardship, in this difficulty. All right, so chapter 5, verse 2 says something pretty incredible. Micah says this. He says, but you, Bethlehem, Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from old, from ancient times. And remember, this is 700 years before Jesus ever comes to earth. But what Micah is saying is he's saying, this is what God is saying to me. There is a king who is coming. Unlike the king that we have right now, who is impotent, who can't do anything to help us or save us or get us out of this mess, there is a king who is coming. And he is coming from ancient times. He is coming from eternity. And when he comes, he is going to be able to take care of you in a way that this king cannot. It's pretty incredible stuff that he's saying here. But did you notice the way that he said this king is going to come? This is what's fascinating to me. He doesn't say this king is going to come and he's going to come with this incredible army and he's going to be riding on a horse and he's going to come in power and in glory. He said he's going to come to the smallest clan in Judah, to this little tiny place called Bethlehem. I think, if we're honest, I think when we are hurting and we go to God and say, God, help, I think what we are hoping for is that he's going to pull the heavens back, open the sky up, the angels are going to come down, and they are just going to take care of whatever it is that we're struggling with, right? They'll come and provide us with the resources that we need, or they'll fight our battles for us. And we want this incredible big thing to happen where we look up and we say, now that was God, because it was huge and there's no way it could be done otherwise. That was God. But do you know what God is saying to Micah? He's saying, most of the time when I arrive in your world, it's not the huge, it's not the miraculous, it's not this overwhelming thing. It's the small and the unexpected, maybe even the mundane. And that's how you're going to experience me in real life. And you're going to have to pay attention sometimes to see it because it's really easy to even overlook this or just call it coincidence or whatever it is. But you know how this works. If you've ever struggled with depression, maybe it's at that moment in depression where you're kind of bottoming out. You're at the lowest point you can be at. And a friend calls you out of the blue and just says, hey, I'm thinking about you. What can I do for you? How can I pray for you? You know what that is? That's the arrival of God in your world. It's the small. It's the unseen, the unexpected. It's the arrival of God in your world. It may be that moment where a temptation comes and you know what temptation is because this is the one that always comes. And it comes back and it comes back. And you try to get rid of it and it keeps coming back. And that temptation comes and you kind of feel like, man, I don't want to deal with this. And right around that moment, a door unexpectedly opens that gives you a way out from that temptation. And it's a little thing, it's a small thing, but you know what that is? That's the arrival of God in your world. And I think that's what Micah is saying to us here. He's setting us up to understand that it's not necessarily going to be the big, miraculous, overwhelming thing that God does when he comes into your hurt or your pain. A lot of times it's just the little, small, unexpected. If we go on in Micah, verse 3 says something really interesting. It almost sounds contradictory. It says this, therefore, Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labor gives birth. And you start thinking, well, wait a minute. Didn't he just say the opposite? Didn't he just say, I'm going to send this king, and he's from ancient times? And what's happening? Why are you now saying Israel's going to be abandoned? That doesn't make any sense. Do you know what I think God is saying? I really think he's saying here that, yeah, I'm here, and I'm coming in a new way, but it's not necessarily going to be in the way that you expect, and it's not necessarily going to be in the time frame that you expect it to be in. And so he just positions this to help them understand that I have not left you. I have not abandoned you. I am a part of your world. I have come and I'm coming to you again. But you are still going to walk through some hard stuff for a little while. Again, that's one of those things we kind of wish God would just take care of all of it, right? Take away the hard stuff. We don't want to deal with this. But even in ancient times, God comes to them and says, it's going to be a little while. Don't give up on me. Don't walk away from me. I'm coming. And it's just not in the time frame that you thought. So he says, therefore Israel will be abandoned until the time when she who is in labor gives birth, and the rest of his brothers return to join the Israelites. And in verse 4, again, it's talking about this king that's coming, the promised king. It says, he will stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they will live securely. For then his greatness will reach to the ends of the earth. And then the last phrase at the beginning of verse 5 just says, and he will be their peace. And it's almost like, I love that, because it's almost like saying, you're expecting me to come and do this incredible thing, but it's really just going to be this one man that comes. And he will be your peace. This one guy, Jesus, that's coming, he will be the solution that you were looking for. And if you know anything about Hebrew at all, you probably know this one word. You probably know shalom, right? That's kind of a greeting. They use that all the time, but it's also a word that means peace. That's the word that's used here. He will be their shalom. And it's not just okay, I feel better. That's not exactly what it's talking about. The peace he's talking about is a completeness or a fullness. And so he's basically saying, in the middle of your hardship, when this one comes, he will complete you. He will be your fullness. He will be all that you need. Pretty incredible stuff. So all of that Micah throws at us is basically saying this. He's saying God often interrupts our hardship in small and unexpected ways that show us signs of his presence. God often interrupts our difficulties, our struggles, our hardship, not with the huge miraculous thing, but with the small, unexpected things. And gives us this whole new understanding, perspective. But maybe more than anything else, helps us to see that if you want to recognize the presence of God in your world, sometimes you have to pay attention. Sometimes you have to be looking for God, because it's really easy to dismiss him as coincidence or happenstance or whatever you want to call it. In fact, this morning as we walked through this passage, there's a little detail in this passage that we have just walked through that shows us the presence of God in an incredibly unique way that I'm guessing you missed. And the reason I would say that is because you really have to dig in. You have to look. You have to pay attention. You have to dig into the passage to see this. But let me just walk you through this, because it's incredible stuff to see what God is doing here. And it's related to, you're probably wondering if I was going to have a meal, while we were here. It's related to the bread that I have sitting up here. And really, to understand it, you have to back up before the time of Micah, all the way to the time of the Exodus. You remember the story where the people of Israel are in Egypt and they're slaves, and God comes to them, and the whole Moses, let my people go, all of that, right? There's a point in that story where the people of Israel look up at God, and they say, how do we know this is really you? How do we know this isn't just some crazy guy named Moses that's getting us in trouble and taking us out of here, right? And so they're asking, again, the same question we're asking. They're saying, how can we recognize that this is the presence of God that is leading us, and not just a good idea that we've had to get out of Egypt? And one of the ways that God leads them is he says, I want to give you a very specific way to help you understand how my presence comes to you. And it happens this way. They get out in the wilderness. They're away from everything. They have nothing to eat, right? And they cry out to God and say, you just brought us out here to die. You know, if you really are doing this, you brought us out here to kill us. We don't have anything to eat. And do you remember what God's response to them is? Here's his response. He says, I want you to recognize that this is me. And so this is what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to open up the heavens and send down bread for you. So that you recognize I'm with you. So that you recognize that this is me. So that you recognize I'm your leader. I'm going to open up the heavens and send down bread for you. And so, not this kind of bread. It's like little wafers, right? It looks a lot more probably like the communion stuff we're going to do in a little bit. But it says, I want you to recognize this. So this is how you recognize me. I open the heavens and I send down bread. In this passage that we have just read, it tends to just go right over our heads because in Western Christianity, we don't pay a whole lot of attention to names. Our names are just names we like, and we pick them from a baby book or whatever, you know, however we decide to name things. They don't necessarily mean a whole lot. In the Hebrew, it's totally different. Every name has very specific meanings. And one of the things that we looked at in this passage, they say, Micah says that this one who is coming will come to the town of Bethlehem. If you've been around the church for a while, you may have heard this before. But that word for us is actually two words in the Hebrew. The first word is Beit, and Beit means house of. The second word is Lahem, and Lahem means bread. And so God, the one who had said, I'm going to open the heavens and send down bread for you. And he did this every day for 40 years to burn it into their brains and their hearts and their memories, right? Every day to say, I am the one who is here, I'm the one who's here. Now he comes along with Micah and he says, I'm coming from heaven. I'm sending one from eternity to the house of bread. Not to the capital city of Jerusalem, but to this little tiny town known as the house of bread. Not too many years, well, 700 years after that. Sure enough, Jesus is born in the house of bread, and he's probably about the size of a loaf of bread, you know, and he comes into the world, and he builds on that analogy where God has been telling them, this is how you recognize me. I send down bread from heaven. I send it to the house of bread. And so in John chapter 6, something happens that ties all of this together that's pretty cool. We're not going to read the whole thing, but let me just tell you what happens. You can go back and read it this afternoon. John chapter 6 starts off with a story that you're probably familiar with, even if you've not been around the church very much. It's a story of Jesus feeding 5,000 men, not counting the women and children, probably 10 to 15,000 people in this crowd. And Jesus feeds that group. Anybody remember what he used to feed that group? Fish and bread. Pretty simple meal, right? Fish and bread. He multiplies the fish, he multiplies the bread. The disciples go hand this out. That's the story that we all know. The interesting part of the story, though, really comes next, where Jesus tells the disciples, hey, let's get away from the crowds. Let's get off on our own. So he tells the disciples, you get in the boats, you go to the other side of the lake. I'll meet you there after a while. They don't understand how he's going to get there, but okay, we get in the boats. They start heading to the other side. Jesus dismisses the crowds. Eventually what happens is after the crowds start to disperse, Jesus walks on water, goes out to them in their boats and joins them in their boats. A pretty incredible thing, right? As he does that, the crowds come to this decision where they basically say, oh, we don't have anything going on in our lives, so let's just walk around the lake and meet him when he gets to the other side. Let's just go all the way around and we'll catch up with them when they get over there. And in John chapter 6, verses 25 and 26 tell us how the conversation went as they met him on the other side. It says this. It says, when they found him on the other side of the lake, they asked him, Rabbi, when did you get here? it's almost like Orion's twofold question. So they're saying, we didn't see you get in a boat, so that's weird, but they're also kind of like, oh, funny to run into you on this side of the lake. Okay, when did you get here, right? And Jesus answers them. He says this, I tell you the truth, and pay attention, this is huge. I tell you the truth, you are looking for me, not because you saw miraculous signs, but because you ate the loaves and had your fill. You know what he's saying? He's saying, you walked all the way around this lake. When I was trying to get away from you, you walked all the way around this lake, not because you were looking for the things of God, but because I gave you bread and now you want more bread. Guys, this is what we do so often in life. We go to God in the middle of hardship and we say, if you would just give me this, then I would be taken care of. If you would just provide this, then I would be taken care of, right? And Jesus is saying, you are looking for physical bread. And that's really all you're looking for, but you're missing God in the process. You're not seeing what God is doing. And so later he explains exactly what he means. At the end of chapter 6, verse 51, he says this to them. He says, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If you didn't get it thousands of years ago, if you didn't get it from all the stories, the way that God shows his presence, he opens the heavens and he sends down bread, right? The way that he shows his presence, he opens the heavens and he sends down his son to the house of bread. And Jesus is at this point where he's saying, you're just wanting a bite of bread. You're hoping that's what you'll get. And he's saying, but you're missing God. He says, I'm just one man. I'm a little small part of all of the population of the world. I'm just a little one person here. I'm one man, but I am all you need. I am the bread of heaven that comes down to give you life. And he goes on to say, if anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. So it's a pretty incredible way that God ties all of this together. And he's showing us through all of these stories, I may not come in a big, huge, miraculous way. I may not come as the meal that you're asking for in the hardship. I may not come exactly the time that you expect me to come. But I arrive, and when I arrive, it may be in these small, unexpected, maybe even mundane ways. But that is my arrival in your world. Pay attention. Because God has arrived. God has come. I mentioned earlier Bethlehem. And as I talk about Bethlehem, there's some interesting parallels between Bethlehem and Wellington, believe it or not. And so Bethlehem was about 5.5, 6 miles away from Jerusalem. And Wellington, 5.5, 6, 7 miles, according to the interstate, away from a bigger city, away from Fort Collins, right? Chances are, people in Jerusalem, very few of them ever went to Bethlehem. They may have known about it, but they, no reason to go. And when you don't have cars, 5, 6 miles is a long way to go. They may have never seen it. Interestingly, as some of you guys know, there are people in Fort Collins that have lived there for 15, 20, 30 years. And I've talked to them personally, and they asked where I live in Wellington. Oh, I've never been to Wellington. Really? Yeah, they've never come to Wellington, even though they've lived here for 15 or 20 years. Wellington is just this kind of small, unknown place. Even though we're growing like crazy, it's still small, unknown place, right? And in fact, there was a pastor in Greeley who had been a pastor of a church, the church he was at for over 20 years in Greeley. And he asked if they could borrow our baptistry, our baptismal. We have a portable baptistry. And so, we let him borrow the baptistry. And so we set it up so that he could come pick up the baptistry. He told me, hey, on this day, I'm actually going to be at a meeting in Fort Collins. He said, I'll be kind of at the corner of I-25 and Prospect. And he was trying to figure out the time that he needed to allot to get up here to Wellington. And so he asked me, he said, from there, will it take me 40 or 45 minutes to get to you in Wellington? I said, man, you're halfway through Wyoming in 40 or 45 minutes. You know, what do you mean 40 or 45 minutes? It's crazy, you know. He's been in Greeley for 20 plus years, and he thinks Wellington is just some way out there town, you know, 40 minutes north of Fort Collins. That's kind of the way that people think about us here in Wellington. They just have no clue where we are. And because of that, I'm guessing when people ask you, where do you live? If they're not from around here, maybe you say Wellington, or even if you do that, you have to kind of give the explanation, right? I'm in this town that's like an hour north of Denver. Have you ever heard of Fort Collins? I'm just north of Fort Collins, right? So we have to explain all of that kind of stuff. It's just crazy to me to think about the parallels, though, between Wellington and Bethlehem, because Bethlehem would have been the same way. Everybody would have looked at Bethlehem and said, what's Bethlehem? Nothing comes out of Bethlehem. There's no reason for a king to be born in Bethlehem. And so just thinking through what God is leading us to do. We talked about the family of churches idea if you were here a few weeks ago. Let me ask you just to dream with me for a minute. What if God chose the small, most unlikely place in northern Colorado to begin to show his presence and to shape the culture of our region? Yeah, let's make it a little more personal. What if God put you in this small town and in this small church to just remind you, I'm with you, so that you could recognize his presence on a regular basis? What if God put you here for that reason? When we are going through hard times, when we are going through difficulties, God does not typically come and give us all that we've asked for in a miraculous way, but he always arrives. It may be in the small, it may be in the unexpected, it may be in the mundane and seemingly ordinary. But let me just remind you, God is closer than you think. You just have to pay attention to see it. So this holiday season, this Christmas season, will you make that your prayer? God, open my eyes to you as you are coming into my world. Open my ears to you to hear from you as you are meeting me and directing me. You make that your prayer and watch to see how God enters your world this year. Let's go to him and ask him to help us. Father, we are amazed by you. We are so thankful that you are God who doesn't just care about the big things, but you care about the details of our lives. That you care about a small town like Bethlehem, in the smallest clan of Judah. You care about a small town like Wellington. And I pray, Father, that throughout this season we will see you over and over and over again. And that we will praise you and honor you and glorify you, not just for the big things, but for the small ways that you interrupt our hurt, for the small ways that you interrupt our hardship. Make yourself known. We pray these things in the power of your name.